Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and you can find all our past shows and links to our social media pages and our donate button on our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org. Come and engage with us. Recently, I seem to be covering some subjects that have been requested over the last couple of years, and I have been interested in as well. We recently had on the show Jan Allegretti talking about vegan dog and cat food. That has been requested a few times in the past. That was episode 88. And today we're talking about growing food veganically, which I'm really excited about. It's also been requested. It's amazing how many aspects of our lives animal farming invades, just beyond meat, dairy, and eggs. There's so many other ways that we can veganize our lives, like the way we grow our veggies, which is what we're going to talk about today with our guest, Meg Kelly. So, Halloween is around the corner, and this holiday presents us with another way that we can be more conscious consumers. Most people don't know, but many of the chocolate companies and chocolate bars and candies that we buy, even vegan chocolates, come from farms that use child and slave labor in Africa. When I first learned about this, I couldn't believe it. I heard this story. I heard about a little boy who was promised a bike if he came with these men to work with them for the day. Like if he came and worked for the day, they'd give him a bike. So he got in their car and they stole him from his home, drove him hours and hours to another place, locked him up, kept him chained, threatened to kill him and his family if he ever tried to escape. And that was his life. This child. I mean, it's unimaginable that a product that I would buy would be produced that way. I don't want to support that. To me, that is not vegan. But the good news is that you don't have to give up chocolate altogether. The Food Empowerment Project, a really wonderful organization, has a chocolate list that they have diligently compiled that lists chocolates that they recommend as being free of child and slave labor, and also ones to avoid. You can even get an app on your phone so you can check right at the store. So, when you're choosing your Halloween candy this year, if you're going to get chocolate, please remember to check the Food Empowerment's list and only buy the recommended brands. And going forward, when you're buying chocolate for yourself, please incorporate this into your life. For Halloween candy, you can also get non-chocolate candy. You can Google vegan Halloween candies, and there's numerous just regular brands that are kind of accidentally vegan. And then there's others that are a bit more healthy that you can find at the natural food stores, like organic lollipops. But I really encourage you to look into this chocolate issue and add child and slave labor chocolate to your boycott list, along with meat, dairy, and eggs. Let's try to make this world a bit better for everyone, humans, non-humans, in any way that we can. And this is a way that we can. Just choose one chocolate over another. There's lots of vegan chocolates that are on the recommended list as child and slave labor free. I'll add a link to the Food Empowerment Project's chocolate list in the show notes. All right, let's now learn about how to veganize our veggies. Here we go. All right, today we have Meg Kelly. She is an advocate for veganic gardening and farming. In 2008, she co-founded the Veganic Agricultural Network to promote fully plant-based food systems that are not fertilized using the byproducts of farmed animals. She now teaches the Learn Veganic Organic Gardening course to empower people around the world to grow their own fruits and vegetables at home using sustainable vegan techniques. Meg has been gardening veganically for 15 years in backyards, on balconies, and in the countryside. And we're really happy to have her. Welcome to the podcast, Meg.
Hi, Hope. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yes, and we were recently in a vegan summit together, Vegan Climate Summit. together, both speaking on a panel. So that was nice, a good way to meet you. And now here we're going to continue our conversation.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So, Meg, we like to start with getting to know you and learning about when and why you went vegan. So, tell us about your vegan origin story.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I definitely started becoming uncomfortable with the idea of eating animals around the time that I found out that meat was made from animals. I went through the first few years of my life not even understanding that, and I still have a clear memory of the day that I found out that the chicken we were eating was actually from an animal. And so that kind of uncomfortableness was something that you know, I I lived with for a few years before deciding to start making changes. And it was when I was around 11 years old that I stopped eating certain animals, but I kept
Wow.
eating others. And
Mm.
and it was really through my teens that I was kind of dealing with that question of, some sort of inconsistency. I knew that I was making certain decisions that were in line with my ethics. I was making other decisions that weren't in line with my ethics. And it wasn't until I was 19 that I had kind of reached that point of realizing that I, in some ways, felt ready, that I had diversified the foods that I liked more, that I liked more vegetables than I did when I was a kid. I was starting to enjoy lentils and foods like that. And so it was really around that time that around the age of 19 or 20, that I made that switch to becoming vegan.
Actually, you had kind of a similar experience to what I had when I went vegetarian and vegan. I did the same thing when I was a kid. I was a little older than you though. I was about 16, and I just realized that the chicken we were eating was chickens. And it just freaked me out. I couldn't believe that we were eating animals because I loved animals, and I kind of made that similar connection, and then I went vegan when I was about 20. So we had kind of a similar experience.
Hmm.
So I invited you here to talk about veganic and veganic farming. So I guess let's just start with the basics. What is veganic farming, and why is it important?
Yeah, so veganic farming and veganic gardening is growing in a way that's organic, but without any animal products. So a lot of conventional farming and organic farming uses animal products like blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion, manure from farmed animals as a form of fertilizer. And with veganic, what we're doing is we're using entirely plant-based fertilizers like hay or alfalfa or veggie compost in order to fertilize our farms and gardens in a way that totally aligns with a vegan ethic.
Yeah, so it's if you think organic, because it sounds like organic, it's kind of like
Mhm.
vegan organic farming.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And the word that was originally coined as veganic was originally coined as vegetable organic back in the 1950s. And since then, the word has kind of evolved to mean vegan organic. So whether we see it as vegan organic or vegetable organic, it's the same thing. Basically, it's plant-based organic agriculture without any reliance on farmed animals and without any reliance on animal inputs.
Okay. And yeah, and I buy my produce all organic, and then
Mhm.
other things, grocery, I try to be as organic as possible, and I, of course, do that for the environment. And I'm certainly concerned with chemicals, things like that. But I've known, for a while now that they use these animal inputs, these like you just listed I mean, just a disgusting, horrible list of things that they use, like the feathers from the chickens
Mhm.
after they're slaughtered, or the bones and blood. And I can't even imagine the disgustingness of all this stuff. And to think about it kind of being in the soil and the residue of my vegetables, it's so awful to think about.
Mhm.
And I try not to think about it. But this is the reality. This is, what all farming uses, even organic farming.
Yeah, and I mean, farming done in a conventional way what we call conventional can involve a combination of chemical fertilizers and animal products, or simply chemical fertilizers. But chemical fertilizers, in and of themselves, have a lot of their own problems associated with them from an environmental standpoint. And then with organic farming, there's a particularly heavy reliance on, animal-based fertilizers, which is, obviously very unfortunate because oftentimes we're buying organic from an ethical standpoint, and organic has so much going for it ethically. Organic is really focused on protecting the soil, on growing in a more sustainable way, on having more biodiversity on the farm, and all of those are wonderful things. But when organic farming is often traced back to animal farming, then it becomes really problematic. With Veganic, what we're doing is we're trying to take everything that's positive about organic farming and then just take it that one extra step of doing it all in a plant-based way without any animal products. And so on my end, I'm certainly in favor of organic farming. I just want it to be plant-based organic farming.
So then what are the advantages beyond it being vegan and it being free of animal products for the animals' sake? I think there's even other advantages, right?
Yeah, and one of them, I mean, when we think about some of the outbreaks that have happened in terms of, E. coli or salmonella on vegetables like spinach and lettuce. There's sometimes recalls that happen for certain vegetables. And it's not necessarily, the lettuce or the spinach was the original source of those contaminants. It's often the manure-based fertilizer that's used that can contain certain bacteria that can be harmful to human health. And even when we look at the antibiotic use that's really prevalent, in animal farming, well, those antibiotics end up in the manure, and having antibiotics in our soil isn't a good thing for soil health. But also, there's some studies that have shown that some of those antibiotics can even be uptaken by the vegetables. It's in very small quantities, but still, when we look at these questions of antibiotic resistance and the fact that animals that are being farmed are given so many antibiotics and that this could, lead to various problems for human health with antibiotic resistance. Well, having those antibiotics, spread over our fields in contact with our vegetables is not necessarily the best thing. And it's interesting to see that there can be these far-reaching effects that we wouldn't have necessarily imagined to begin with. Also, in terms of heavy metals, a lot of animal manure and other, animal byproducts can contain heavy metals. When we have these industries that are problematic to begin with, and then our fruits and veggies are traced back to those industries, there can really be all sorts of extra effects that we weren't expecting.
Yeah, it's so frustrating when there's these recalls, like you said, on like lettuce or salad mix or other greens, and it's an E. coli outbreak. And it's not the lettuce that has E. coli. No, E. coli is a bacteria in the intestines of animals.
Mhm,
And so it's from the manure and the fertilizer, the animal fertilizer. It's always so frustrating that they don't tell the whole story, in the
mhm,
in the news stories about what's going on, and that it's not lettuce that's the problem. It's animal products and animal foods and animal farming that
mhm.
is what is contaminating the fields, right? So frustrating. And there's got to be a climate change connection. When you're farming veganically, it's got to be better for global warming, for the climate issue, right? I mean, it's reducing animal farming.
Absolutely, because animal agriculture is one of the industries that is having the biggest negative effects on climate change. And by having our fruit and veggie production tied back to it, it means that in some ways, the weight of animal agriculture is still implicated in the production of our fruits and veggies. If we switch to veganic growing, that's the way that we could move away collectively as a society, away from animal agriculture to entirely plant-based food systems. Because right now, the plant foods that we're eating, they're in many, many ways tied back to animal ag. So if we want to make that shift away from, the climate damaging animal ag to something that's fully plant-based, we really need to use veganic as the route to get there.
Yeah, it seems like someone should possibly do a comparison
Hmm.
of plant farming, conventional plant farming, using all the animal inputs and manure compared to the same amount of land or whatever same amount of food farmed veganically. It's got to be a reduction, a major reduction in the climate impact.
Yeah,
It's
it's a major reduction in greenhouse gas use, and also in terms of land use, in terms of water use.
right.
Animal agriculture is just inherently so inefficient that if we want to move toward a more efficient way of farming, from all of those environmental perspectives, really cutting animal agriculture out of the equation is the way to do that.
Yeah, something we don't consider, this is a huge part, could be, I think, a huge part of the climate change, climate disruption puzzle. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it is really exciting that we have an option. There is a way to grow without animal inputs, veganic. But there are people out there, that would say that you have to have animals to farm. You have to have the manure to farm, that you can't do it without animals and animal inputs. What do you say to that? How do you respond, and how can we do it without animals?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that animals are not a source of nutrients. So, animals may have nutrients in them or in their manure, such as calcium or phosphorus or iron, but those nutrients are only there because the animals ate plants that contained those nutrients. And so, much in the same way, that you can get calcium on a vegan diet by eating plants directly instead of drinking milk. Well, you can get nitrogen or phosphorus in your fertilizer by using plants as a fertilizer instead of using manure. Because when we think of what manure is, well, manure is just plants that an animal ate and pooed out. So basically, if a cow eats hay and then poos out that hay, well, the manure is just made out of hay, and all of the nutrients in it, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen or potassium or other nutrients that your plants might need, well, they originated from the hay or from the other plant materials that the animal ate. So there's really no reason at all why we need to bring, farmed animals or domesticated animals into this scenario. We can just use the plant materials directly and fertilize our plants with those. And the soil itself contains such an array of soil life, such as bacteria and fungi and earthworms and nematodes, and just such a wide array. And those soil organisms have the natural function of taking plant matter, breaking it down, and making the nutrients available for the next generation of plants. And really, that's what happens out in natural environments like forests. Leaves will fall on the ground, plants will die back in the fall. The soil organisms will digest it and make the nutrients available for the next generation of plants. And really, we're just imitating that natural cycle when we farm and garden veganically.
Wow. That just makes so much sense. I love it. I never realized or thought about that, how we have to kind of rethink where we get nutrients, how we get
Hmm.
nutrients, because animal products have been so prominent in our food. We think that calcium comes from milk or iron comes from meat, but really it comes from the plants. And so we're kind of reframing and rethinking about that with vegan food. So it's the same with veganic gardening,
For
right?
sure.
We've got to like rethink that, okay, the nutrients actually came from the plants originally. So
Yeah,
whatever you need, like nutrients, phosphorus, you can get it from the plants.
yeah, and the plants get those nutrients right from the soil. So plants will get phosphorus from the soil and calcium from the soil and potassium from the soil. And it's the plants that have those symbiotic relationships with the soil organisms in order to get those nutrients. And one that's really cool is nitrogen, because nitrogen is in the air all around us. Every breath we take is mostly nitrogen. And nitrogen is a nutrient that plants really need to grow. but most plants aren't able to use nitrogen from the air. But some plants, like legumes, can actually fix nitrogen, which means that they are able to take the nitrogen from the air and put it into the plant directly. So it's really, really cool because one of the techniques that we often use on veganic farms or gardens is to grow legume plants, and that can be things like beans and peas and soy and clover. Clover is also a legume. And those plants just bring extra nitrogen into the system. So we can take things like beans and peas and clover and grow it and just cut it down and use it as a fertilizer for our other plants. So it's really wonderful because oftentimes people have this false perception too that having animals on a farm or a garden can make you more self-sufficient. But oftentimes people are bringing in all sorts of, outside food in order to feed animals. But what I love about veganic is that we can really make gardens and farms that are really, really self-sufficient by growing our own fertilizer, by growing things like alfalfa and clover. Even buckwheat is really good at mining nutrients like phosphorus. So we can just grow certain plants specifically to feed to our other plants. And it's just amazing to participate in this cycle where we can really tap into some of those natural mechanisms that would happen in natural ecosystems, but just imitate them in our farms and our gardens.
Yeah, so we do not need animals to farm. It is unnecessary.
Completely unnecessary for sure.
Wow, cool. So you co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network for people to kind of connect about this and learn about veganic gardening. And I'm curious about your history with gardening veganically. You've been doing it for a while, and you don't own your own home, and that's something else. People often think that you have to own your home. It seems like this barrier to being able to break ground and actually, garden is that you have to own your own home. But you have done this for years without owning your own home. I'd love to know what your path was to veganic gardening. What got you started and why did you found the Veganic Agriculture Network?
So I co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network back in 2008 to promote plant-based farming and gardening, especially in North America. It was around the time that I was becoming more interested in how our food was grown, and I found out that my fruits and veggies were being grown oftentimes using animal byproducts. And in a lot of ways, it was really disillusioning, to realize that I had made that decision to become vegan, and yet my fruits and veggies were grown in non-vegan ways. I actually co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network before I even started doing any gardening myself. And a few months later, I started gardening, and I was extremely lucky that the person I co-founded the Veganic Agriculture Network with, whose name is Steph Groslo, he had actually already been gardening veganically for several years. And so he was able to introduce me to a wide range of techniques, and I was able to start gardening veganically right from the get-go. I never had to make any transition from animal products to veganic. I started veganic right away, which was just such a wonderful experience. And I've been just gardening absolutely anywhere that I'm living. So over the last 15 years, I've rented apartments and I've sometimes rented the floor of a house and I've moved around to different places. And everywhere I've lived, I've found ways to garden. When I was in an apartment in the city, I had a balcony garden with some pots that I had made myself from reclaimed materials. And I also had a community garden plot. So I just put my name on a list for a plot at a community garden, and I got one after about a year. And I gardened in the same community garden plot for more than 12 years using all veganic techniques. And other places I've been renting that have had, backyards and front yards, I've either just asked for permission to put a garden in, or sometimes I've just put in a garden and everyone was okay with it. And I also garden at my neighbor's house. So one of my neighbors had a bit too much space in her garden to take care of it all herself. So I started gardening on half of her land. And I've actually found that I've had more opportunities than I can take up. And that if we look around at the possibilities, often we can find places. If we have friends who have backyards, sometimes they don't have the time or the energy or the knowledge to do a garden themselves. And oftentimes people can be quite happy to share their space, or to have someone come and garden in exchange for getting part of the veggies. So if we look around for solutions, we can oftentimes find areas to grow our own food. And we can also start projects in our community. We can start community forest gardens, or we can grow gardens at our, kids' school and places like that. So we just need to look at places where the land is being underused, or even places that have concrete where we could put some, raised beds or containers and just try to green these areas and grow some of our own food veganically.
If someone is totally new to veganic gardening and they want to maybe get into it, maybe just start a little bit of something, what's just kind of the first steps that they can take?
So I really recommend that everybody start by making their own compost, because making our own compost is one of the easiest ways that we can fertilize veganically. Because if we take our own veggie scraps and fruit scraps and autumn leaves, for example, and mix them together, after a few months, it will break down into compost. And once it looks like dirt, we can use that as a fertilizer. So I recommend that as a great place for people to start, because sometimes when we start gardening, we end up wishing that we had started composting a year or two earlier. So even if you're not entirely sure yet if you want to garden, it's a wonderful place to start. And it also cuts down on our greenhouse gas emissions significantly if we compost our own food scraps instead of sending them to the landfill. So, one of the easiest techniques I know for composting is to take one part of your kitchen scraps, two parts autumn leaves. So, for example, one bucket of kitchen scraps, two buckets of autumn leaves, mix them together. And you can do it in a compost bin or in a compost pile. And yeah, I just think that's the best place that you can get going. But if somebody wants to start a garden right now and they don't have any compost ready, one thing that you can use as a fertilizer is alfalfa. So, again, we were already speaking about this idea that manure is just plants that animals ate. Well, oftentimes manure is essentially made out of alfalfa, because a lot of animals eat alfalfa and then poo it out, and that's what manure is. But we can just take the alfalfa directly. So I've bought alfalfa pellets or alfalfa meal, which is kind of like an alfalfa powder, and we can use that to fertilize our plants. And that's one of the easiest ways we can do this if we're looking to buy in a veganic product.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, and there's also some products available online that I've seen and I know about. Plant-based plants is one of them, right? That it's
Michelle Carrera.
right, Michelle Carrera, who started Chili on Wheels, a vegan food program. So there are some online options, right? That you can, I guess it probably comes in a plastic bag. That's going to be a bummer. But if you went to the store, to your local gardening store, you probably can't find veganic. I mean, I think it would be very hard to find veganic anything at a gardening store, right? And that would be in a plastic bag anyway. So there are some online options.
Yeah, yeah. So it's true that if you go to a typical gardening center, almost everything is going to be chemical based or animal based, with the exception of possibly alfalfa or possibly some type of wood mulch. But almost everything. I went into a garden center recently for the first time in years, and it was boxes of blood meal and bone meal
Yeah.
and
Oh,
chicken manure and
so
all that.
gross. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend garden centers as the best place to start, but there are luckily several companies now that are starting to sell veganic products. They're not always labeled that way. Sometimes you have to check the ingredients or write to the companies or look at their frequently asked questions to see if it specifies. But we are seeing bigger and bigger interest in, veganism and in plant-based products. And so when it comes to fertilizers and potting soils, this is finally starting to catch up. It tends to be country specific because it can be really difficult to send agricultural products across borders.
Oh.
So, for example, if there's a certain vegan product like those from plant based plants that's available in the US, it might not be available in other countries, even through shipping. So, I think there's, a huge need
Mm.
for vegans to start companies in order to create veganic products, that can be supplied to home gardeners. For example, if somebody's starting a garden on a balcony, well, yeah, usually that involves buying some products in. So I'm really heartened to see that there's at least a few places that are starting to do this, and I very much hope that it's going to expand so that veganic gardening becomes more and more accessible for people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that they can't really ship to other countries. I didn't realize that because you're in Canada, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, so you might not be able to order something that's in the US.
I have tried, and normally, yeah, the shipping on each website is normally limited to the US,
Wow.
and there's just more regulations around shipping agricultural products out of the country, or it might have
Okay.
to go through an approval process before that can happen. So that's one thing that makes veganic a little bit more complex than certain other vegan products, because most vegan products you can just have them shipped across borders without any problem.
Right.
But with something like soil or fertilizer, sometimes it's a bit more complex.
Hmm. And sometimes veganic is called stock free, right? Is
Mhm.
that mostly in the UK?
Yeah, so there's a number of different words that have been used for this, and it is an important thing to bring up because if somebody wants to learn more about plant-based farming and gardening, it's good to know all the words that you can search for. So, veganic is one word, another is vegan organic, another is stock free, and stock free was from that idea of livestock free. So that's kind of a short form for that.
Mm.
And in Germany, the word biocyclic is used more. And all of these refer to methods of farming and gardening that are all plant based that don't rely on farmed animals at all.
Biocyclic?
Yeah, so that's BIOCYCLIC, biocyclic.
Biocyclic. Okay. So I wanted to ask about farming and wildlife or gardening and
Mhm.
wildlife because farming, gardening, it's often at odds with wildlife or in conflict with wildlife, the animals eating either the leaves or the fruit or the food or even just digging, messing up the gardens. So what are a couple of things that people could maybe do with their home garden that mitigates conflict and benefits wildlife?
So on my end, I really like to go with the idea that I'm taking an area and I'm making it more biodiverse than it was before. And the reality is, more often than not, if we look at insects, for example, the vast majority of insects are beneficial or neutral to our garden, and there's only a small percentage that are problematic.
Hmm.
And so I really like to go with the idea of, for the most part, inviting everybody in. It can be a little bit tough because when we look at the way farming and gardening is often practiced, it's kind of the idea of pushing everybody out,
Yeah.
trying to make it so that, no animals are interacting with the gardens. What I like to do is say, for the most part, I'm going to invite everybody in. And knowing that, yes, I will have some crop damage. Yes, I'll lose some tomatoes. But there's also going to be all of these benefits. I'm going to have a lot of pollinators visiting my garden. I might have some toads visiting my garden. I might have more birds visiting my garden. And those birds, sometimes they'll be eating the berries that I planted. But the way I see it is, I planted something that's feeding the birds. I planted something that's feeding wildlife. I really like to look at it as I'm growing something to improve the environment, to improve biodiversity, to help support wildlife, and I also get a lot of food from it too. And I really like looking at it that way rather than having, a very specific ownership mindset of that's my tomato and somebody ate my tomato. I really like to look at it as I get some tomatoes and there's someone else, other animals who are getting some tomatoes too, and then that can be okay. So, one thing we need to remember is that oftentimes we've really destroyed the habitats of wildlife. And, we've paved over, there's not necessarily access to rivers and streams anymore the way that there used to be, because oftentimes the rivers and streams have been paved over too.
Mm.
I really see this as a way that we can create something that gives back to wildlife and that welcomes wildlife, and it's also beneficial to me. Yeah, I think it's very, very important to think about the ways that we can help support wildlife, especially in areas where ecosystems have been damaged. So one thing I like to do is just to add water points in my garden. A water point can be something like a bird bath. It can just be a little bowl of water that's sitting out. or it can be more elaborate, like adding like a micro pond to my garden. And oftentimes animals are just, missing water sources, especially in cities. So I think one of the most important things we can do is put in water sources because it's just a kind thing to do for animals to begin with. And we also might have, birds setting up their homes because birds really like to nest in proximity to a reliable water source. Another thing I like to do is just make sure I have a wide variety of flowers for pollinators, especially having some plants that flower really early in the spring and others that flower really late in the fall, just to make sure that we help support pollinators throughout the season. Yeah, so I've had birds nesting in my berry bushes, and I've had all sorts of pollinators visiting my garden at times when other gardens have nothing growing in them. But I've put these flowers in that will attract the pollinators. And yeah, I think we really have to think about, how can we make our garden a place that also benefits wildlife?
I love that concept of inviting in instead of keeping out.
Hmm.
It's really beautiful. What a beautiful concept. Yeah, we should be inviting nature in, inviting the animals and insects in. And I also like that idea of sharing. It's like
Hmm.
it's not your tomato. There are several tomatoes and you share. The animals get some, you get some.
Hmm.
You know,
I think that there's scenarios too where, we might decide to put up a fence, for example. If someone lives in an area where there's a lot of deer around, well, yeah, we might put up a fence around part of our garden in order to have cucumbers and lettuce that's able to grow without being munched on by the deer. But outside of that fenced off area, well, we can still put apple trees for the deer. We can still put other food that the deer will appreciate. So there's ways that we can also keep a little area reserved for us and then have a larger area that we can share with wildlife.
so you teach an online veganic gardening course, right? So if someone's interested in doing this and getting going, or if they've even if maybe they've done it for a while and want to learn more, tell us about that online course that you teach.
So, this is a course that we really love teaching because it brings together people from around the world who are all interested in veganic gardening. And I love the fact that we all approach it from the same mindset. We're all going into it knowing that we want to have gardens that are friendly to animals, that are sustainable, that are entirely plant based. And my goal is really to show people a wide variety of veganic techniques so that people can understand which techniques might work best in their particular situation, whether someone has a balcony or a backyard, or whether someone wants to do a big ambitious project like a homesteading project or a forest garden, for example. We show people that wide variety of ways that we can garden using vegan techniques. And yeah, our goal is really to equip people to garden veganically in any situation they might find themselves in for the rest of their lives. It's something that we started about 3 years ago. And even for us, it's just been a wonderful opportunity to connect with a network of people who are interested in gardening in a vegan way.
And is it ongoing, or are there, sessions or semesters, or how does it work?
So, our main course is around February, March, where we have dozens of people who come together to learn veganic gardening in a 7-week course. And then at other times of the year, we sometimes also have the course available on a self study basis. I really recommend for people to join us around the February, March session. And normally we have registrations open for that in January. So people can find out more at learnveganic.com. And we also have a really cool guide there, which is a guide to 20 veganic materials for your plant based garden. So if somebody wants to learn more about us and start learning more about veganic gardening techniques, that's a great place to go to get some more information and to start discovering the wide variety of ways that we can garden veganically.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be sure to put links in the show notes to your website and more information.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about larger scale veganic farming. So I know there's not many, unfortunately, especially in the US, but you do have a map on your Go Veganic website that has some veganic farms around the US. Is there like a certification program for veganic farms like there is for organic? There's, of course, organic certifications, state and federal certifications. How does the certification happen for veganic farms? And yeah, talk a little about the larger scale picture of veganic farming.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Veganic Farm Map, which is available on goveganic.net, that lists some of the farms that are in North America, but not necessarily all of them, because it just lists the farms that decided to add themselves to a map. So if somebody is looking at that map and is wondering if there's a farm in their area and they don't see one that's available, I would suggest talking to farmers in your area. There are a lot of veganic farmers out there who you won't find out unless you start asking them individually. And in terms of certification, most veganic farms are not specifically certified as veganic. Some of them might be certified through other programs like organic certification programs, but we have seen veganic certification become recently available in North America as of last year. So there's now a certified veganic program. Right now, it's just a small number of farms that have that certification because the program is so new, but we're hoping to see more and more farms become certified. And then in England, there's another certification program called Stock Free Organic Certified, and there's a number of farms in the UK who are certified through that program. And based in Germany, there's also the Biocyclic Vegan certification. There's a number of biocyclic vegan certified farms around Europe and in other countries too. So there's now 3 certification programs. When we look at organic, organic is something that many of us were just hearing of for the first time, 20 or 25 years ago. And if we look at how much it's grown, and if we look at how much veganism has grown in the last 20 years too, I think the potential is there for veganic to also grow significantly. So it's still in many ways in its early stages, but I can certainly imagine a future in which we can see a much larger number of veganic farms and also certified veganic farms.
Yeah, so this new certification in the US, or is it all of North America, is
All of
just
North
new?
America.
All of
Yeah,
North America. Okay, and it's just newly started last year. What's it called?
that one is called certified veganic.
Certified Veganic. That's really exciting. I love
Yeah,
that there is a new certification here. That's great.
yeah, it's really wonderful to see, and it's also wonderful to see that some of the farmers who have been farming veganically for quite a number of years now are getting much more involved now as activists to try to promote veganic and to try to create certification programs or to create events or to give talks and, provide educational opportunities because that's one of the things that the veganic movement needs. We need more training programs and more certification programs in order to kind of bring this movement forward.
So, speaking of education, you're going to be hosting an online veganic summit coming up in November. So, I would love to hear about this veganic summit. Tell us about this.
So we're really excited about the Veganic Summit. It's coming from November 10th to 12th, and it's bringing together veganic farmers from the United States, from Canada, from England, who are going to be sharing their expertise in the plant-based farming techniques that they've developed and refined over the course of decades. And it's also a summit in which we'll be showcasing the experience of several veganic gardeners too. People who are growing fruit trees in their backyards, people who are growing in greenhouses, because we'd really like to inspire people to grow veganically at whatever stage they're at, whether it's somebody who's starting their first garden, or someone who wants to start a homestead, or someone who may want to convert a farm from non veganic techniques to veganic techniques. We really want to show that we can grow veganically on any scale at all. And yeah, so this is a 3-day event. People can sign up for free. We also have an all-access pass to get a bunch of bonuses like live Q&As and live networking events. So the website is veganicsummit.com. And yeah, if you're curious about veganics, if you're thinking of growing veganically yourself, or if you're just interested in understanding this issue more so that you can speak to other people about veganics, I'd really recommend signing up, and we would love to see you there.
Yeah, it's very exciting. We'll definitely put a link to the summit website in the show notes, and I encourage everyone to go and check it out. Exciting. That's awesome. Good job. I know how much work big events are. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for putting it together. And it's really, really exciting.
Yeah, and just in case we didn't mention it, it is an online event, so people can attend from anywhere. And no matter what time zone you're in, we're setting things up so that you can still watch all of the presentations.
Great. So you'll record the presentations for viewing afterward or
Yes, exactly.
okay, perfect. Well, Meg, it's been really amazing to hear about all this. It's so important and makes me realize that once again, I'm going to walk into my produce section at the grocery store and start thinking about blood meal and bone meal and disgusting things like that, and how important this is that we figure out how to access more veganic farming, whether it is personal and on a gardening level, or and more importantly on a larger scale. I think that we need to get more farmers growing this so that we can get it to the masses of people. Really, really important stuff. Thank you so much. So, we do need to wrap up. So, I want to ask you our final question, and that is, what gives you hope for the future?
So, just from a veganic perspective here, one thing that gives me hope is that I've seen the veganic movement really blossoming a lot in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's been getting a lot more attention, and we've been coming a lot farther in terms of sharing expertise, people publishing books specifically on veganic farming and gardening. And that really gives me so much hope because this is a movement that has been very slow to grow, and just to see how much the vegan movement has taken off in recent years, to see that the veganic movement is starting to do the same thing, it gives me hope that we're going to be able to make that transition to fully plant based food systems because that's what we need from an environmental perspective, from the perspective of compassion towards animals. We really need to make that full transition to plant based food systems. And yeah, I'm having hope that that can happen. And I would love to see more and more people involved in making that change.
Well, Meg, I've really enjoyed having you on. I've learned a lot, and this is such important work you're doing. Thank you for all you're doing. You have so much going on with the gardening classes and the Veganic Summit coming up. We'll definitely have links to everything in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me here today, Hope. And I really enjoyed sharing veganic farming and gardening with everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I liked how Meg suggested to talk to your local farmers about this. And I was thinking that a good thing to do would be to just go to the farmer's market, go down the row, and just ask if they grow veganically. And it's very likely that they don't, and that some of them don't even know what that is. So, this would be a great way to introduce them to the concept, show them that there is some demand for this method of farming. I think I'm going to do that here in my area. Please share this episode with anyone that you think it would benefit, any gardeners that you know, perhaps, and scroll down to that 5-star rating. If you're listening on an app, give us those 5 stars. We really appreciate that. I hope you have a spooky and fun Halloween and make it vegan.